I thought it would be, rather than trying to talk about global partnerships in kind of a generic sense, kind of almost a theoretical sense, I thought it would be much better if I gave you a little bit of a drill down on kind of what's happening with global partnerships at Asbury, and particularly what this means in a particular case study of it, which I know the most of, but all of these can be shared. And I've been to all of these locations. I know all what's happening in all these places. But what we have here is a map of places and institutions where we have partnerships at Asbury Theological Seminary. This actually is only looking at institutions like ours, theological institutions that are training people for ministry where we have partnerships. We also have partnerships we're building with mission organizations, which actually will be probably most fruitful in terms of the church planting side of what we're doing globally. But I want to focus on this particular now because you can see we're having partnerships around the world, and these are growing. We don't really necessarily want to have a lot more than this, but we want to have places that are rooted in every continent, and we want to have the ability to exchange faculty, exchange students. We want to create a much more of a global exchange of what it means to be a student at Asbury Seminary. We just signed this week a partnership that we've already been kind of living into it with Overseas Council International. Dr. David Baer is the president of OC International. We've been friends for many, many years. And they train global leaders from around the world. There are many, many leaders of the church that are in situations around the world where they have, that we call them ABD, all but dissertation. They went through some program somewhere, they've gone back to their home country, they can never quite write their dissertation. And so I realized that Asbury had a great opportunity to help advance the global church. And so, for example, one example is Freyo Tamarit. He is the president of the Ethiopian Evangelical Seminary in Addis Ababa. So I've known Freyo through other connections through Lausanne. So I said to Freyo, he'd probably been working on his PhD, has coursework done for probably 10 years. But he just didn't have time to do his dissertation. He was too distracted. He's the president of the seminary over there. He has no time. I said, Freyo, go talk to your trustees. Tell them to give you a semester off with no responsibilities. Come to Asbury. We will feed you. We will house you. And you full-time write and finish your dissertation. He came here. He did that. He finished it. He graduated with his doctorate. I mean, it's just one little example of what Asbury can do to help further scholarship. Around the world, there are many scholars that have never been to write books. And we are able to give them opportunity to come here and write and study. So the idea is that if you're going to create a situation where international scholars can actually write books and to start their own seminaries, their own Bible colleges, their own organizations, there has to be a way to facilitate that, and Asbury can be very useful in that way. So what I want to do today, though, is focus particularly on India. India is famous for the cow, but you see the world on the cow? India. I want to look particularly at India, and I want to focus particularly on kind of the situation in India. If you can see this map in some ways tells the history of missions, Western missions in India. India is the only country in the world, or one of the few, I should say, not the only, one of the few countries of the world that has all 7 strands of Christianity in it, kind of pancaked on top of each other. So if you look at some parts of the world, only have one particular strand of Christianity. But Christianity in India has an apostolic layer. St. Thomas arrived in India in 52 AD. There's a whole St. Thomas tradition in this part of India here. And that goes on to this day. The Martoma Church in India trace themselves back to St. Thomas. He's also he's interred over in Chennai. You have the Eastern Orthodox tradition. The Syrian Orthodox Church came into India by the 3rd century, very, very ancient there, very devoted. There are a number of Syrian Orthodox Christians all throughout India. They have the whole Roman Catholic tradition with all of its strands, Dominican, Franciscan, etc., Jesuit. You have all of the Protestant 19th century missionary movement, with Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, all of everything imaginable. Then you have the ecumenical tradition, which when India became independent in 1946, they started the an ecumenical movement which brought together all of the churches. So many of the churches in the South that were formerly mission churches were united together into the Church of South India. And then a few years later, they formed the Church of North India. So the CSI, CNI, are they're members of the World Council of Churches, and they're part of that whole ecumenical side of things. And then you have, sixthly, you have the emergence of the Pentecostal movement, which has been very vibrant across the world, and many people track it as kind of a separate branch of Christianity because of its own unique features. And then finally, you have the indigenous movements within India itself that have arisen. So India has kind of a pancake of traditions, churches that were started last Tuesday all the way to St. Thomas and everything in between. So it's a very, very complex, interesting kind of world. But if you go to India, what you'll discover is that India, most of the church planting took place all in the southern part of the country and over on the coastal. Here it's essentially southern, coastal, and then this is part of tribal India, where they were never Hindus over here, and there's a high percent of Christians in this part of India. This is where Kema Pachwa is from, by the way, if you don't know Dr. Kema. But what you'll notice is that this heartland of India is completely unreached. All right, so when someone talks about how many Christians there are in India, it actually doesn't mean a lot. Because what it really means is, Christians are mostly here and here. And yet this is the heart of Hinduism. The Ganges River starts up here in a place called Uttarkashi. It runs all the way down the Ganges Plain out into Calcutta. So the Ganges Plain is widely regarded as kind of the heartland of Hinduism. Well, you see, it runs right through the heart of unreached India. India has several thousand people groups that have never heard the gospel. If you look at a map that shows kind of where Christians are, you can see that down here, and this kind of visually says just what I said earlier, if you draw a line like this across India, you can see that 85% of the Christians live over in this part of India. As you get up and the dark red means up to 1 million Christians in that district, especially down here, the dark red, you'll have a district here with over 1 million Christians there. Whereas up here, you'll have, when it gets into the light yellow, 100 Christians to 1,000 Christians, 12 to 120. Where we're located in the school is in the 12 to 100 Christians in the entire district. Okay, so there's dramatic differences regarding where India kind of plays out. And some years ago, there was a real interest to pioneer a seminary right in the heart of the mission field. Most of the seminaries, of course, are down here. So that's kind of what has led to where we are today. I wanted to show you the school that Dr. Tumlin mentioned is located up here in this extreme northern part of India in a state which is now called Uttaranchal. Uttaranchal is a mountainous region. When I first went there, this was actually part of this state, but they later subdivided it off and made it into kind of its own mountainous state. And if you look at this state, it's a very, a lot of mountains and farmland. People live there, very rural kind of farming. You see, very primitive kind of conditions. The high-tech kind of world of India that you often see on the news today with all the changes and dramatic, all the high-tech, like the internet stuff, and all of those things, it's all South India. Okay, so North India doesn't really have the kind of hip, Bombay culture that you hear about in South India. People, marketplaces, rivers. This is the Ganges River basin runs, as I said, through the whole of the country, or that part of the country. It's also a place of pilgrimage. This is a place called Haridwar. Haridwar in Hindi means like the gate or the mouth of God or the Lord. And Hari is the word for Lord, Dwar is gate. And this is the first place where the Ganges River actually hits the plains and becomes like a river. So up to this point, it's kind of tumbling down through the mountains, and it gets to this spot, and it broadens out into a broad kind of river, as you see here. In Hindu literature, one of their stories is that at one point there was a big struggle between the demons and the gods. And what happened was in the course of this study, they were struggling over this substance called Amrith. It's a substance that brings eternal life, like a milky substance. And they were fighting over this because whoever got this would have the ability to dispense eternal life. In the course of this struggle, 7 drops of this liquid fell out of this bowl they were fighting over. And they fell into 7 spots in India. Now, these 7 spots are famous in India, and they are places of pilgrimage because they believe if you go to that spot, you can receive eternal life. One of them fell right here, according to their belief. So Haridwar is a very, very important place. There's a nearby place that's famous in the modern world that is similar, but it's the place where the Beatles went. When the Beatles went to India, so people go there often because the Beatles went there. But this is the more historic kind of place. That's a place called Rishikesh. But this is the traditional pilgrimage spot, and you can see the pilgrims gathered here, coming on the river, to dip in the river and to receive forgiveness. A lot of these are called Shiva temples. Shiva is one of the major gods in North India because the Ganges River comes out of Shiva's head. I'll show you some other slides of him later. Very, very prominent god in this part of India. These pilgrims will come. They're called Kavalis. There are certain periods of time every year. They call them Kumbh Melas. It's a big festival where they come, and there's a certain propitious month, a 28-day period, where if you go there and you get the Ganges River water and bring it back to your home and pour it into the mouth of your loved one who's dying, that they will have eternal life. So there's millions will come to the river at that time to get this, what they call Ganga water, Ganges River water, and bring it back. And so this big, elaborate thing is really all about carrying some water buckets. And this person has a more basic one. You can see little buckets of water here on either end of these kavalis they carry. And they will pack into trains and buses. And the way it works, even if you have a ticket, when you get on a train during this season, they'll have the train packed out. And it's not polite to ask them to leave because they're like, on a holy venture, holy journey. And so you makes traveling during this time of the year really difficult. I mean, really difficult. I've been through it many, many times. But it makes you realize kind of the dynamic of this whole part of the world. And the idea of starting a seminary there is really was unthought of, unheard of. The idea of putting a seminary in that part of India, very close to this pilgrimage spot, and we do church planting in Haridwar, in these places, it was unheard of. And so this is kind of the vision behind what would happen if a seminary could put itself on the mission field. Okay, now that's important because, see, Asbury is emerging as on a mission field. And who would have belonged, in 1923, Henry Clay Morrison would probably never have believed that he would live to see the day that we now see, where North America is becoming the fastest emerging mission field in the world. So, I understand what can happen when you conceptualize it and what it meant for this seminary. I mean, to give you one example, in my classes in India, I taught for years at another institution, and when I was teaching in the U.S., essentially they were their laptops taking notes like they do here. And for them, the information is almost like theoretical. Someday I may pastor a church, whatever. But when you have students who know when they graduate, they have to go and plant the church that they're going to pastor, it does have a way of focusing the mind. There's no pension plan. When I was in ministry, one of the top things people used to argue about was the state of their parsonage and how deplorable the pension plan and the salaries were. Okay, I get that. I had a $12,000 a year salary. When I first got my first parsonage, my wife and I arrived, and she's here now, so she can testify to this experience. We got there, and they had like crime tape across the parsonage. I thought maybe they'd killed the last pastor. They hadn't. He had gone out of town. But what they had done was they had the city had finally come in because the pastor had vacated the place, and they had inspected the parsonage and declared it uninhabitable. So the parsonage was condemned by the city. So I arrived there, and this is one of those great moments that you will all appreciate, because there's only something that church members can ever do to pastors. It's one of those things where you just got to be there to actually know this really happened. But they said this to me, thinking it would comfort me. They said to me, but Pastor, don't worry. We've talked to the city, and they've allowed you to occupy the ground floor. I was supposed to feel better about that. But the bottom line is we had a beautiful 2-story home, but we could not ascend the upper story. It was unsafe. The only time anyone ever spent the night there was when Julie's great aunt, who spent 33 years in India, came to visit us, and we had no place to put her. And she said, well, I'll go upstairs and sleep up there. And we said, it's been condemned by the city. There's crime tape across the door. Oh, I've done worse than that. Don't worry. She marched up there and spent the night. So she got through the night all right. But the pilgrimage time is unimaginable. I mean, this gives you a little feel for the scope. I remember the first time our daughter Bethany, she's been there many times and worked there and taught music there, but during the Kumbh Mela, going over to Haridwar, and I never forget the time when we were traveling over the road and we kind of crested the hill where you can go out and see this. And it takes your breath away, because you realize you've never seen so much of humanity in one spot in your life. And in fact, every 7 years, well, it's actually different places they're all in 12-year cycles, but it comes out every 7 years. It's somewhere in India, they have what they call a Maha Kumbh Mela. Maha is like the great Kumbh Mela, where it's even more propitious to go there. And the number of pilgrims is so great at that time period that they say, like the Great Wall of China, you can actually see the movement of people from space. I mean, I can't even describe the sea of humanity. So when Jesus in the text looks out and we're told he sees the crowds harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and that's when he says the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. You never feel that more than when you are out looking out over that scene right there. The plentiful harvest, the amazing, immense people who do not even know the name of Jesus Christ. We were in one village where in India, the most popular, like a vacuum cleaner type machine, is put out by a company called USA. And the word in Hindi for machine is a borrowed word from English. And so in Hindi, the word for machine is machine. So a sewing machine or a vacuum cleaner, these things, they're called USA machine. So apparently somebody had been in this village trying to sell sewing machines, which they call USA machine. We didn't know they had been there and trying to get people to buy sewing machines, and they had left. And so we come some weeks later, we're there preaching the gospel. And in Hindi, the word for how you say Jesus Christ is Isa Masih. Because Isa is the word for Jesus, Masih is Messiah, Isa Masih. So Isa Masih, USA machine, pretty close. So I got up at the end of our time, people were coming forward talking to us, and one lady was coming forward wanting to receive her sewing machine, because she thought we were there promoting a sewing machine. Now, what's so amazing is because it shows you in this part of India, the knowledge of Christ is so low. People don't have enough knowledge about gospel, Christianity, Jesus Christ, to know the difference between Jesus Christ and a sewing machine. All right? I mean, this is that dramatic in terms of the absolute no knowledge of Christ. The opportunities here are just immense. People bringing their offerings to deities. This one they constructed just since we were there. When you read the book of Daniel and you read about these huge idols that fill the air, this is a picture. It's hard to see the resolution, not great from this particular screen here, but it's a picture or a statue of Shiva. And Shiva holds in his arm this that's called a trishul, like a trident. This is a drum that he uses to beat to create the world. It's called a damaru. And he has a snake around his neck. This is the head of a snake. The Ganges River actually is embedded in his hair. He has dreadlock hair. And he's there. This is a particular auspicious hand signal they do. But this figure is so large that when you walk up to it, your body does not come to the top of his toe. Okay? I mean, you just can't, from this perspective, you can't really see. These are some of my high-powered electrical wires that are kind of there in the sky, so it's hard to get the perspective here. And the trees are here. You get a little feel for it. But this is a massive statue that he'll come there to worship. And they're looking for Shiva to save them and deliver them. And raised, by the way, out of the pockets of very, very poor people. It's very, very common in India for these pujaris, they call them these, we'd say pastor or leader of the sanctuary, the temple. These pujaris will come around and they'll collect money. And they'll do it in a way that's almost extortionist to people. If you don't do this, you'll be under a curse. So when the text in the scripture says, the devil comes to kill, steal, and destroy. I have come to give you life, give it more abundantly. I always thought that was kind of a spiritual verse. He comes to bless us spiritually, etc. But I have seen that in India, the work of the evil one literally impoverishes people. He literally robs them of, even what little they say will be taken away from them. So having been involved with this ministry for many years, I know the inner workings of all the finances. And I know villages where we're often accused in India when Christians come into villages, they often say to us, in fact, it's one of the top 15 things that we've charted, they say to to Christian pastors, is they'll say, well, you must have paid people to become Christian. The reason they charge that, especially North India gets that, you paid them and so they converted because you paid them money. But the reason that they do this is because they notice that people's lives start changing. And so the amount of money that's spent on this kind of stuff, on idol worship, on building temples, on endless kinds of divination for various things. If you're going to have a baby, if a woman is pregnant, the amount of money that's extorted in order to prevent that baby from being eaten up by a demon is extraordinary. One of our main church planters is a young man, his name is Lemuel Patanayak, who came to the Lord because his mother had a vision of Jesus that came into the room and knocked down all these idols, including Shiva, in a dream. So she refused to dedicate her children to the deities, instead gave him to the Lord. She became a Christian. And they all was told her, the Goya God will eat your baby. And so when her baby was born perfectly healthy, it was a very powerful testimony because this is used to rob people and impoverish people. So when we have villages that have come to the Lord, next thing you know, their home was like a thatched roof. Now it's a tile roof. They had no school, then they have a school. They began to use their resources to actually help people and strengthen the culture. So it's amazing the dynamic of the gospel and how it actually, strengthens the society. Because Indians are brilliant people. They're very brilliant people. And as you know from so many wonderful Indian scientists and leaders, they're very, very sharp. And yet this religion has choked them and kept them away. And this is part of it right here. This is one of the main deities that's worshipped in North India. This is Ganesh. And this is, again, that's also the same deity before Shiva, his wife Parvati. This is the college, NTC, that Dr. Tom mentioned earlier that we now have a partnership with at Asbury. You can see it in the foothills of the Himalayas. This is the founder of it there, George Chavnikamanil. And we're kind of looking over the campus here at this spot, some of the buildings here. Even putting this cross, give a little context for this. To put a cross on a building in South India is not a big challenge. There are crosses everywhere. North India, this is not an easy thing to do. We're in a city, of all the cities of North India, Dehradun is a place that has particular kind of leeway because it's a kind of an educational hub in India. So there's people there from different parts of the country that have different experiences, and therefore they're a little more tolerant of Christian presence in that particular city. But where this particular location is right in the heart of Tibetan Buddhism in North India. So as you may recall, when the Chinese, of course, they overturned the Tibetan government, a lot of the Tibetan Buddhists migrated to North India. So they came to certain spots in particular that they thought look like Tibet. And so where we are very much visually looks like Tibet, the mountains and all the around there. So the Tibetans constructed major monasteries right around where we are. In fact, we joined property with a Tibetan monastery there. So we have a lot of interaction with Tibetan monks there over the years. The road from the main road going down to this institution here is a very, very rocky, rutted road. It used to take like 20 minutes just to kind of get down through all the ruts to get to the gate. And so we share that road with the Buddhist. So at some point, the Dalai Lama was going to come and visit the Buddhist monastery next door. So the Buddhists went all over creation raising money to pave that road. And finally, after a year or so of fundraising work, they paid the money, had the entire road paid. We were like, praise God for the Dalai Lama, coming to North India and visiting. So they paved the road. It turns out the day of the actual event, after a year of work preparing the road for the Dalai Lama was so busy apparently at that time that he didn't have the time to drive from Dharamsala down to Dehradun, though we're not that far, and he flew on his helicopter. So he landed on the property without having set foot on the road. So we always said that the road was actually for us. So now you can get down to our campus in about 30 seconds. It's really, really nice. But anyway, the Dalai Lama has been back several times since then. He has now been on that road. But it's right there, we're joined property with the Buddhist. In fact, you can see some of the Buddhist dwellings there behind this shot there. And you can see the Himalaya mountains in the background. This is right at the foothills of or what we call Himalaya mountains. Various buildings on campus. Students there in classrooms studying, a lot like students here. They just sit a lot closer together. Pack them in. Great, vibrant worship services. One of the great differences between often seminaries here, and this is, again, all this is lessons that I think the majority of the world can teach us. Because one of the things I've really learned is that as you become more connected to the global church, what happens is there's learning, giving and receiving on both sides. It's very, very vibrant. And so over many years working with Indian Christians, I am definitely in the debtor in the relationship. In other words, over the course of many years, I was there to help and assist in the development of this school. I always felt like I went away with more than I ever gave. Because there were so many things about the gospel that they got and they lived out. And so one of the differences, as I mentioned earlier, alluded to, is the idea that, if you're a pastor, there's the line between pastoral work and evangelist work is very, very thin. Okay, here it can be kind of like a different office almost. And pastoral work is often more internal work with the church, the existing church, and you find somebody to help with evangelism. But in India, North India, every pastor must be an evangelist if you're going to really get on with the gospel in these situations. They have to plant the church they're going to pastor. So we started, the school was started in 1987. Well, we officially opened the doors in actually April of 89, but we started the buildings and all that kind of stuff in 87, and opened the doors in 89. At the time, to be honest with you, I didn't fully realize the power of what God would do. I thought, okay, we're training people for the ministry. They're going to go out and get churches or whatever. And as I realized, I kept seeing more and more the real missional context of where we were. And so I realized we needed to start a church planting network. And the point of this was to say, what if we were to, in fact, originally we would say, well, if they go and plant churches, God bless them, go out and do it. But the government itself forced our hand on this. And so we keep meeting people that say they come from you. Who are these people? How are they connected to you? And so we finally realized we needed to found an organization. India is very particular about the legality of all kinds, especially North India. Everything has to be done through legal procedures. And you couldn't use, for example, outside money. You can't bring money into India to do church planting. So the Indian government wants all these organizations registered, and then they very carefully track every rupee that goes into it to see where the money came from. We get audited every year by the government. So you can just imagine if the IRS audits you every single year. And they audit you with the explicit joy of finding something you've done wrong. All right, so we're used to this. It's a constant thing. I've spent, so many hours poring over financial stuff with government people in India, because that's the way they, that's the way they approach the whole thing. So we are very careful that only money that comes into India by Indians, like through the tuition money of the school, goes to church planting. So we usually outside money mainly use it for training students. We're allowed to do that. So we can basically use outside fundraising to build buildings and to put salaries for professors. So all the tuition money that students pay for tuition really gets put over into church planting. So what we do, we created a network which eventually was called the CEA, the Christian Evangelistic Assemblies. It's not connected to any organization else, really, but the CEA. And this organization began to plant churches. And we started out with, like 15, and then it went to, 25, 50, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, now over 600 churches. And for us, and every organization does this differently, but for us, we don't really count it as a church until it gets to a particular point in its cycle. So we have hundreds of other what we call prayer points. These are like pre-church setups where people are meeting, worshiping, but they've not yet had their first communion together. There's things that we do before we say, okay, you're a church. So there's hundreds of other kind of things kind of in the pipeline that will someday be churches. So this is thousands and thousands of churches that are emerging from the graduates of this one school. And so this is part of the meetings that we have. We go out into the villages. People gather together. We'll do church planting. We'll preach the gospel, and people will come together and start forming communities of faith and of worship. Most of these churches meet under trees or in very humble facilities. One of the challenges in North India that you wouldn't have here, but in North India, it's Hindus will not sell land to a Christian. They just won't do it. We had a big breakthrough a few years ago, and because of a very deep personal relationship with a Christian man in our work, he had served this family so faithfully through some illness and challenges that they kind of wanted to respond by selling him a piece of land for him to build, a personal home on. It's like unheard of in North India. Schools and things like that, you can buy land for schools, things that they think might help the community. But in terms of churches and pastors owning homes and all that, it's very, very, very difficult in North India. So in order to get around that, you have to be able to use facilities, common facilities, people's homes, other kinds of public spaces, just anywhere you can imagine. One of my favorite places to preach, and I've been in so many different kinds of places, but one of our graduates, his name is, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, it'll come to me. But he started this church in a state called Orissa state. It's over in it's like northeast part of Maine, India. Very, very hostile area for the gospel. And there's no way no one would allow him to buy any land there. But he found there was these two buildings that had an alleyway between them that was you could just touch the wall on either side. So the alleyway is right now literally the width of my span here, about 6 feet wide, and all the way back. It was a kind of long thing. So they got permission to cover the alley with tin, put a door on the front of it and on the back of it. And so when you open the door, you go into this church. It's only 6 feet wide, the kind of space they have. They're literally meeting in an alleyway. And they have the church there, and there's the little curtain, and then you have where the pastor lives. So it's the church and the parsonage, okay? And they pack in there. So I've preached there several times. My most memorable experience, my very first time preaching there. Okay, first of all, you're in an alleyway between two buildings. The roof's covered in a tin roof. That's important. And there's two buildings on either side of you, both occupied by Hindus. Well, the people who occupied those buildings were themselves renters. They don't like Christians in that space, worshiping on Sunday morning or any other time. So there's one spot where there's a hole like knocked in the wall, which is the entrance to the other building. They used to have a fan or something. And so there's a little space, airspace between the little alleyway and the building. So whenever the worship service happens, they will take a speaker, like a boom box or something, like a loud, like a thing, and they'll put it on that hole on their side, put Hindu music on it, and turn it and crank it all the way up. So there's this Hindu music just blaring into the church, and the congregation, is singing, they're in the midst of their worship service. And then, especially during the preaching time, I'm sensitive to that part, I get to preach, and the whole time you're preaching, Hindus are in the streets outside getting rocks and lobbing the rocks up onto the roof. Okay, so I don't know if you know what it's like to be inside a space like that with that close quarters. And by the way, it's only about 110 degrees in there. But you're in this little space, but when a rock hits a tin roof in that kind of compression space, you think a rocket has exploded. So the whole time you're preaching, it's like, bam, oh my goodness. And bam, and then this Hindu music blowing in. And what's so amazing about it is, like, to me, this is not your typical Sunday morning experience. But for them, this was typical. They said, we just sing louder. We just clap louder. And I loved it. I went back to the parsonage, okay, just a curtain, okay, behind, and there on the side of the wall, he had a map of the world, and it's just amazing, kind of the vision that we're bringing the gospel to India. And you have this feeling as you walk across India, and even those situations, despite the hostility and the problems, that Christianity is not in the rearview mirror, it's in the front windshield. You feel it at every turn. And it's a really, really powerful experience. And the fact that you have these gatherings like this are truly remarkable. People are hungry for the gospel. In my previous work, I oversaw the organization that produced the World Christian Encyclopedia and World Christian Trends and all the data and all that. It produced like global Christianity data. And Todd Johnson, who directed that program, at one point he created a metrics for determining how to define resistance to the gospel or acceptance of the gospel. And he did this to try to determine whether you could develop patterns of where people groups are responding to the gospel, where they're more likely to come to Christ if you preach the gospel, and where there's most resistance. And I'll never forget when he came to us and he presented the top 20 most receptive people groups in the world. Okay, this is looking at 24,000 people groups globally, and he's choosing the top 20 most responsive to the gospel. All 20 were located in either India or China. All right? So even though Hinduism is a big challenge, and the story, the narrative is how resistant it is, when you actually preach the gospel, there's a lot of response. I've often said people often confuse having heard the gospel with resistance to the gospel. There's a big difference between those who haven't heard and those who are resistant. And so we are trying to make the gospel more accessible. The other interesting point about the document, that data, was the top 20 most resistant people groups in the world were all located in Western Europe. All right, so you want to challenge the French, the Swiss, the Poles, extremely difficult. Go down the list. It's really, really interesting data. It's in the World Christian Trends. You can see it for yourself. But the whole point being that we have to recognize that if you're in the Western world, we have a missiological challenge that we cannot diminish. It's very, very important. And so I have learned, despite the fact that a number of Indian people groups are coming, the resistance is still great, is still formidable, a lot of challenges, and we can learn from that as we go through it. This is one of our churches. This is one of our graduates. This is actually in a Reese estate. These people haven't realized they need 2.2 parking spaces per member. They didn't get the latest Lyle Schlater book or whatever. They don't have that. They're meeting out in the open like this. They're more flexible. That's the great thing I love about church planting is people are flexible. I've seen, especially some of the new ACNA churches, have been very inspiring because I've known churches that have walked out of gorgeous facilities that took generations to build. I mean, stained glass windows with mahogany pew, rounded mahogany pews. I mean, everything you can imagine. Walk out of that and end up meeting in a schoolhouse somewhere for the sake of the gospel. It is very, very inspiring. And my wife, years back when I was at Princeton, my wife was the organist of a church like that, gorgeous facility. And all they talked about was their building, how great their building was, how beautiful their building was. You walk in the door, they had these like little historical pamphlets of the history of the building. And it was a magnificent building. Well, one day, we got the call, it was a Saturday night, and the pastor called and in tears and said, the church is on fire. And if you remember this was when we had a lot of church arsons that were around the country. Someone took a Molotov cocktail, threw it into the church, and burned the entire thing down in one night. Okay, this was a church that had been built for generations of work and effort. And the church, the very next week, found themselves meeting in a school, like a school cafeteria, with like plastic green tiles, sitting in metal chairs, folding chairs. But I was there for 2 years in that little church. And what was so amazing was the ecclesiology that emerged. It was amazing. I mean, I know it's hard to even say it because that was an act of the devil. But if there ever was a time when you say, God, you meant it for evil, but God used it for good. God used even that evil for the amazing good of re-missionizing that church. And they actually reconnected with the community in ways they never would have done before. And they actually kind of reinvented themselves because they had all that taken away from them. It's amazing. I learned that right there in that circle as well. They had an ecclesiology that I felt like that I had lost. As I said before, it's located up in this area. And if you go, this is that same state here. Okay, I'm going to blow this up to the whole map. This is the area I want to really focus on right here because I just brought some of our trustees from Asbury to this spot. And it's a great thing to bring trustees there. I'll try to wrap this up quickly. But this is a place in North India where in this entire district, it's actually a number of districts, there are no Christians whatsoever. And we don't even know of anybody who ever even brought the gospel there. I mean, it's just a complete no Christians there. There's a seat of a Hindu goddess called Kali. It's a very, very fierce goddess that's worshipped in North India that's seated there. That's where she's like enthroned, and even the parliament members from parliament, in India has a higher and lower houses of parliament, and the people from the Lok Sabha, the lower house, will go up there for the open parliament and bow down to her, ask for her blessings, and there's this kind of thing. It's a very, very demonic kind of region. This is what it looks like on the ground when we first went up there and began to survey this area. Towns built on the ridges, and so forth. This couple was the first couple that we sent there to this region. And his name is Samuel P. Rajan. His wife is Hema. And they go there to pioneer this work. Now, in this place, you can't even start a church the way you would normally think of because there's so much opposition to it. And so they wouldn't let them even live there if their purpose was to preach the gospel. They wouldn't be allowed. But they would allow us to start a school. So we started a school which he insisted we name Mount Carmel, which is like really in your face, I love it. The Indians, they're very bold about that kind. We're going to name Mount Carmel, So they started this school. You can see the children that began to come. It's just remarkable, the beautiful kids that come to this school. And there, we're able to teach them Christian songs. And the whole thing is a multi-generational strategy. If we train these children, they will someday be receptive to church planting. And that's been a great development over the years. We also learned we would go into villages and would build, where you couldn't have a baptismal font, would build water collection storage areas to collect rainwater, because that's a big need there. But it also could double for baptismal fonts. So we've used this to baptize people quite a bit over the years. This is a man named Lamuel Patanai, one of my students. This man, this is the one that I mentioned that his mother, was told, she didn't give her son to the demons. This is him. This is his father, and he went to this village in a Reese estate was beaten up multiple times. Prabhu could have done a study just on this area of India. It's amazing the persecution these people have undertaken. When I first met him, he was so bruised, you could hardly recognize him, his features. And when he graduated from our program, I said, Lemuel, what are you going to do? Like we ask all our students. He said, I'm going back to that village. He kept going back. And here he is baptizing the first 30 people in that village. Now there's thriving churches in that whole region. It's truly remarkable. Some years ago, another great lesson I've learned for here is that I did a survey of 200 church planters over a 2-year period, having them record every question, like what are the questions the Hindus ask you? This was eventually compiled, and I took the top 15 questions. This is published in English and in Hindi. This is Aapki Sawal Hamari Jawab. Your questions, our answers. And this is a name that I use when I publish in India. This is like my Indian pen name, whatever. And we used this booklet, and we identified what were the things that Hindus most often ask Christians. Now, this is the thing that really will surprise you. I wonder if it will surprise Dr. Tumlin, being in theology education for a long time. I found out that the top 15 questions that Hindus actually ask Christians when they came into a village, none of those were being addressed by our curriculum. All right? So there was a huge disconnect. Here we were in the North India, building a school. We had a vision for it, but our training was disconnected from the field realities. This is one of the biggest lessons seminaries can learn, because we have our own ideas about what he will need. We never actually talk to people like you that are actually out there. Now that you're out there, what do you wish you had learned in seminary? What do you think you need in like these type training sessions, whatever? Okay, this was a revolution to me, because I realized, oh my goodness, we need to actually connect our seminary training to the field better and more effectively. That created a big revolution in how we approached our training. We now, for example, our 3-year MDiv program is now a 4-year program. The 3rd year is complete on the field. So they go to school the 1st, 2nd, and 4th year. 3rd year, they're out on the field. We can teach so many things in the field we can't teach in the classroom. I mean, it's just a remarkable program. I learned a lot about how education actually happens. We have a number of regional centers. I won't go into all that. We don't have time. These are programs where we bring people in, kind of like here. These are people that will never get a seminary degree. This is a Strategic Advanced Leadership Training, SALT program. They come in, they're already church planners, they're already doing it, and they come in for 2 weeks at a time, like intensive type work. This is now done pretty commonly in the U.S. in more recent years, but this has been done in India for a long time because they're flexible. It's been really remarkable. We started orphanages with this work. This is a young lady here. This little girl here was in some of these villages. They're such remote areas, and the children are completely neglected by their families. And so we found this girl had so much typhoid and dysentery and so many diseases. She was probably within 2 days of dying, at the most 2 days. She was so limp, you'd think she was actually already dead. But she still had life in her. We asked the parents to let us take her to the hospital. She allowed us, and then a year later, she is singing and rejoicing before God. The amount of kind of grassworks, good gospel work that's being done in terms of the changing lives, education is remarkable. Here's a place we started a school in a place called Teraswania. This is a part of India. In India, whenever they have dignitaries come to North India, they want to clean the streets up. They'll clean up all the prostitutes from the streets, and they'll just take them and dump them off in Teraswania. Teraswania is known for a human dumping ground. So we go to Teraswania. We start a school there, training for kids, elementary school, and we have all these programs for training the kids and giving the mothers of these women new skills. It's been unbelievable good gospel work in this part of India that's a refuge, human refuse. I mean, the opportunities for ministry are, these are the kids of all those prostitutes right here. All these kids are children of prostitutes. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We give them all uniforms, have these programs, and they have great training program. Here's Julie, my wife, in there with one of the classes. I won't go through some of the thing, but this is closing. This is Asbury signing our partnership. You can see there's Kima right there. He was there that day. And this is their principal, president of their school. This is the founder and his wife. And these are other leaders, the board of trustee member and leaders of the ministry. But Asbury now has a partnership with the school and this church planting organization doing all of this. I mean, to me, if you think about that, just this 1 hour together, you've gotten a little glimpse of an amazing, fruitful thing that's happening. I'm only giving you just a little thumbnail sketch. Great evangelism, great gospel work, good social work. We probably have at least 15 elementary schools that we run, orphanages, sewing centers. It's unbelievable good gospel work being done all across North India. And Asbury now is connected to that. Simon Samuel, this man here is coming here. Oh, sorry. He's coming here to teach a course. He's an expert in Mark's Gospel. I go there and teach every year. We have others that go there. Kima's been there. Have you been there yet? Okay, Dr. Tillman, we'll got to get him there. But the opportunity for exchanges is truly remarkable. So we see our partnerships as a way of connecting Asbury to a lot of vibrancy in the global church. And I've also been in this world long enough to know that it is not simply the Western church that becomes passive while the global church does all this work. There are a number of gifts that we have in the Western church that the global church needs. That North America is part of the global church. We have gifts to offer too. And so part of the process in being a global church is recognizing not only the gifts they have to bring to us, but also being renovated to realize that we also have gifts that we bring to the global church. Granted, we're playing harmony, not melody right now. We're learning to work with others. We're going to work collaboratively, but we do have gifts that we can offer the global church that are beautiful as well. So when that comes together, it's a beautiful symphony. And I really hope and pray that Asbury can learn to connect itself with the global church in some very powerful ways in the years to come. And all of these partnerships are like this in terms of their vibrancy, opportunities for growth and learning for our institution, and preparing young people for the ministry. Well, my time is up. Thank you so much for the time to share this with you, and please pray for Asbury that we would be faithful as we seek to serve the global church. Thank you.